Recording 8. Bourned. I was worried about this one. I don't know what it was, but I was perturbed by it before I even opened the blasted letter. I'm sorry, This was a confusing letter. It arrived in a small old wooden box and was folded over several times to fit. The small aged paper has thin handwriting stretched over the paper portrait style. Then the text runs across it again horizontally, words overlapping like a language tartan, as if the writer has tried to use the paper to reach the maximum word limit. As if that didn't make it hard enough to read, the author may not have had the best grasp on the English language, which, in my opinion, makes it all the more worrying that this Tobias seems to be enamoured by me. Well, you'll see. My dearest Lisa, I will endeavour to make this letter more worthy of your acceptance than the last one, which was so shabby a one that I think Mr. Jackham would never charge me with the postage. I know it's been a long time, but I wish to share with you the story of how I came to be Bourned. I know you was always desperate to find out how I came into this being. However, I warn you, it's not too kind of a story. I mean, it wouldn't be, would it, with how ugly and malformed I be now? A short time to go, well, before either of us were even alive, there was a woman. Actually, she wasn't much more than a young girl, really, Mary Maureen Marcus, although she was commonly spoken to as Mur. For brevity, that has nothing to do with this story. I just thought it was a humorous addition, so I'll go on. Mary worked Friday to Wednesday at the Royal National Hospital, a large building set high above the cliffs up at Grand Ventnor. She was an assistant nursery, earning around £1.50 a week. She had little to no knowing of medicine, and could only offer kind words and her scarves, which she toiled at knitting for her favourable patients. These poor souls were plagued with the crippling disease running through most of England at the time. Tuberculosis is a terrible condition, fairly easily cured, as you said, with the witchy named antibiotics. The cloggy air and general living world of towns during the late 1800s choked its residents into many an early grave. That's why the hospital was built so close to the coast. The Victorians believed the seaside to be restorative, or at least great for easing sickness, although only the richest could really pay to be treated at places like that. Where was I? Oh yes, Mary. Mary was often placed on burning duties. In other words, burning bedding that was soaked with sickened bodily fluids they couldn't be reused. This was a joy to Mary, as she never really wanted to be on the ward. She was a squeamish thing, and the haggard figures of the patients frightened her almost senseless. Likely 'cause she had only seen her mother taken with the sickness 4 months prior to her working at the hospital. She was a lot of the time alone in this task, as the hospital very rarely got rid of such expensive items as bedding. Cold November evening, Mary was finishing her workload for the week and was spooked by a noise. Considering that perhaps the noise was coming from a patient that had somehow managed to walk or crawl out of the garden, she stopped her work, staring out over the fields back to the long ornate building she'd just struggled from. She could see not a living thing. No bone-thinned beings wobbling upright, or any of the nurses who used to drink on duty and often stood outside so as not to be caught by the cranky head nurse. This didn't stave off the worsening she felt creeping up on her as she stood lonely at the hospital furnace, as the sea winds grappled at her uniform and the waves crashed on the rocks below. The sound ran out again, although this time she could clearly make out where it was coming from. It was coming from the rusted furnace. The sound of knocking. Opening the furnace, she found the furnace to not even be on. Instead, inside she discovered a scarf. Mary recognised the scarf as being one of her own handicraft, as she hadn't quite managed to do up the ends correctly yet. As she held the tattered, miserable item, she noticed movement. The string at the end of her own scarf was trailing off into the darkness. As she wound the string, she felt it snag on something in the darkness. Hoping it was merely a rock, she started to follow it, winding up the string as she went. The string being the only thing she could cling on to, she could do nothing but trail after the seemingly never-ending line of wool, leading her further away from the hospital. As she walked, she worried that she was moving closer and closer to the cliff edge. However, she was drawn on by whatever was holding the string. She could hear the sound again, along with coughing. Fearful for what could be a sickened man, she picked up her pace. Her fear of the encroaching cliff became panicked for this sickened wretch who could be trapped on her scarf, who could step off right to his death. Becoming more and more concerned for the being, she ran after the disappearing string without being able to make out a foot in front of herself. She found the awful material again, grabbing at it as it disappeared into the furnace. Mary crawled in after, desperate to save the poor man. That's how burnt to death, screaming into the night as she banged on the door of the furnace. The next day, all they found was me, a small creature chewing on a trail of charred string. Or at least that's how the story goes. In reality, Mr. Jacken reckons she had an affair with one of the rich patients from the mainland, and when he passed, she tried to burn the offspring in the furnace and left town. But I think there might be something in the tale told by the locals. Something tells me she didn't live after that night. I apologise, oh loveliest of lovelies, for frightening you, but I thought you should know, seeing as it was so important to you. Oh, my Lisa, I wish I could see you once more, but it shall never come to pass. And this I know, till my grave, I am yours, ever, Tobias. Yes, well, as you can tell, this is a letter that feels personal, but in a more unsettling way than a lot of the others. Tobias seems to actually be talking about a real place that I found in my Great Britain A to Z. However, I cannot seem to find reference to this Mary. The hospitals, the cliffs, even the furnace I can find reference to after a rather infuriating day at the library I had. I even rang some people who actually live near the area. It's at the bottom of the Isle of Wight. However, even their local historian couldn't give me any details about such a story. There is no local record for a Tobias or a related Mary, but it isn't entirely impossible, which is perhaps the element I find most disturbing. That was Letters to Lisa, recording 8, Bourned, written by Phoebe Critchlow, read by Caroline Lawrie.